And so now, to help us carry on this conversation, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Stephanie Bertels. Stephanie is the director of SFU-BD's Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability and the founder of the Embedding project. And that brings together leading global firms to help them embed sustainability across their operations. Stephanie partners regularly with executive teams and boards of global companies that are focused on improving their sustainability performance. And today, Stephanie is going to share some insights into strategies to embed sustainability into organizations. So Stephanie, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll pass things over to you.
Thanks, Lori. It's a delight to be here today. So when we think about embedding sustainability, where we really need to begin is with the conversation that you started with last time. And that's really understanding that on every dimension, whether that's population, greenhouse gas emissions, water use, and land use, we're seeing rapid growth and we're seeing an acceleration of that growth. And as a result of that, the world is beginning to recognize that, in fact, there are limits to economic growth. And that as we move forward in our strategic planning, we really need to think about, on a number of different dimensions, how, as an economy, we're going to start to bend those curves back in the right direction. And so that really means thinking about a shift to systems value. So there has been a lot of talk lately about the shift between shareholder value and stakeholder value. And that certainly has been an important part of the conversation. And it was one that was recognized even by the Business Roundtable in the United States last year. But at the same time, what we see is that shift from shareholder value into stakeholder value, or a triple bottom line or a shared value framework, often for companies still results in well-intended initiatives, but not necessarily really changing the fundamental strategy of the business. And so increasingly, the leading companies are starting to realize that they are embedded within a set of social systems, embedded within an environmental system, and that all of those really have an impact on their strategy going forward. And so what leading companies are starting to think about is really, how do they manage those tensions and try and pursue systems value? So what that means then is that our approach to strategy making really needs to shift. And it's about institutionalizing within your strategy process and within your capital allocation process this understanding of the need to get to know those environmental and social systems, understand the resilience and health of them, and then understand what role your company needs to be playing in helping to maintain them. So 50 years ago, Mike Porter told us that we really needed to be looking around at understanding new entrants, understanding the potential for substitutes, understanding the needs of our buyers, and understanding the resilience and health of our suppliers in order to really manage business. But there are two other important forces that we need to think about, and that's the societal resilience of the communities where we operate and the underlying environmental systems health. And so what's driving the shift that we're seeing in the economy? The most important of the shifts really has been this movement towards the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So in the wake of the last financial crisis, the G20 came together and the Financial Stability Board asked themselves the question, what could be the next trigger for a major economic crisis? And what came forward really was the potential impacts from climate change and specifically from the physical and transition risks that it might present. And so as a result of that, it has actually really changed conversations in boardrooms, because it spread out through the sovereign banks into the AAA banks, and then into the lending conversations of major financial institutions. And as a result of that, has made its way into boardrooms all over the world. And it sparks a conversation really that is changing from a historical focus on forecasting to complement that forecasting work with scenario planning work, to really start to think about what the future might look like. And as a result of that, what does that create in terms of the impetus to be prepared for that and to allocate capital in order to be on track to do that. And so as a result, we're seeing a host of companies around the world that are starting to articulate a science-based target, which is to say a climate target that aligns with the IPCC's, the International Panel on Climate Change, recommendations for keeping our system within 1.5 degrees of global warming. And so as a result, we've seen a lot of companies over the last year start to articulate commitments to net zero by 2050. And some companies even start to create the climate pledge to recognize the need to get started on this and act more quickly and start to try and achieve net zero by 2040. So all of these climate commitments really become a signal that our market, our economy has started to accept the idea that there are limits. And if we look at the green part of the curve that I'm showing, what we also realize is that to actually really get down to that level, it's not only going to be a reduction in emissions, it actually is going to require some negative emissions in the sense of some carbon capture and storage. And so climate, though, is also just the beginning of the constraints that companies are starting to face and realizing that they need to work within. And we've seen a movement across Canada and in the province of British Columbia around the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And just last week at the G7 meeting, we saw an announcement that there will be a new task force on nature-related financial disclosure. So what does that mean for companies then? It starts with undertaking a thorough scan of the environmental and social conditions around you and understanding the extent to which your business has direct impacts and indirect impacts within your value chain on these various issues, and understanding where you might be best placed to try and help to support and act on them. And then it's really about acknowledging the role that you need to play when it comes to environmental, social, and governance factors, and also in setting credible strategies and credible goals and targets to achieve it. So one of the places where we really need to start then for many companies is around understanding what issues are in fact most material to them. And our second panel today is really going to pick up on this theme. And David will walk us through how it is that companies can start to think about identifying these material issues. Where most companies have started is to have conversations with external stakeholders and to start to understand what they're seeing in terms of the issues that matter to them, but also the constraints that that may place on the business. And that is a really important part of getting started on this process. I would encourage companies as well, though, to think about really reflecting in a very systematic way on the various planetary boundaries. So whether that's climate change or biodiversity, ocean acidification, to think about to what extent these changes and also the crises that we're facing in particular issues. For instance, we are seeing an enormous amount of loss in biodiversity. There's a lot of conversation about the thresholds that we're crossing with respect to climate, but maybe the thresholds that we're crossing with respect to phosphorus and nitrogen get less attention these days. And for some industries, that's going to actually be quite relevant. and to also really think about the local economic resilience, the social resilience of the communities where you're operating, and taking the time to understand and ask those communities about their resilience. So it's also about prioritizing where you may be able to have the greatest impact. And so which issues are the ones where you have direct impacts, where there are big impacts sitting within your value chain or the customer's use of your product or what you're financing, or simply because of your resources, because of your access, because of your influence, that you might be able to um, provide um, positive influence within the system and be able to act in trying to help move things along. And then, we encourage companies as well to articulate a credible position on key issues. So investors are now starting to ask for this. We've seen thousands of position statements issued in the last year on various topics, whether that was on climate change and climate risk, on Black Lives Matter, on Indigenous rights and reconciliation. So there is a need for companies to help the general public, to help the communities around them, and to help investors understand where they're taking, what approach they're taking, and what position they have on that issue. And so we've compiled for you a database, and this benefited from support from CPA Canada to help you identify leading position statements. And then the next piece then is to think about also setting credible goals. And so similarly, we've assembled a goal database that helps you identify leading commitments set by companies around the world in a range of industries. It helps you to benchmark your own goals. And if you're in the process of designing goals, to get a sense of what strong, credible goals look like. And so you can filter a search based on sector, based on issue, based on company. And it really gives you a sense of how to set a goal. And we're very transparent in the public information we've used and gathered, and we provide those examples. So those databases, both on position statements and on goals, may be a really helpful starting point for you, for those that are earlier in their journey or those that want to benchmark against best practice. So we have a ton of free resources to help get you started on your change journey. And so I just encourage you to go ahead and use those resources.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Stephanie. You have brought such a rich and informed perspective to the discussion. And just to put a plug in for the embedding project that Stephanie was just going through, that public database that you've compiled with the leading goals and commitments, position statements for benchmarking is really a helpful resource. I've spent some time in there myself, and I found it to be incredibly helpful. So I do encourage everyone to take a look at that.